Looking back now, 47 years later, I can still feel the humidity of that Vietnamese morning clinging to my skin like a second layer of sweat. Cu Chi, 1968. The name alone makes my hands shake sometimes, not from age, but from memory. I was 19 then, fresh off the transport from Montana, where the biggest danger I'd faced was a rattlesnake, or maybe getting lost in the Bitterroot Mountains. Nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for the reality of that forward operating base, where the red dirt seemed to absorb the screams of wounded soldiers and the jungle pressed in like it was trying to swallow us whole. The heat was the first thing that hit you, not just warm, but thick and alive, like breathing through wet cotton. Then came the smell, a mixture of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, rotting vegetation, and something else I couldn't identify. Then, but now know, was fear. Pure, concentrated fear, seeping from every man's pores. Our base sat on what used to be rice paddies, now churned into a maze of sandbags, corrugated metal, and desperation. Helicopters chopped overhead constantly, their rotors beating like mechanical hearts, bringing in supplies and taking out the wounded, sometimes just parts of the wounded. But it was what lay beneath our feet that truly terrified everyone. The tunnels, miles and miles of underground passages that honeycomb the earth like some nightmare ant farm. The Viet Cong had been digging them for years, creating an invisible city right under our noses. Supply routes, weapon caches, living quarters, hospitals, an entire world of shadows and death waiting in the darkness below. Every soldier knew the stories. Men who went down never came back up. Bodies found weeks later, if they were found at all, twisted in impossible positions in collapsed passages. Booby traps that could take your legs off or fill your lungs with poison gas. And always, always, the enemy waiting in the black. That particular morning felt different, though. Heavy with the kind of tension that makes your skin crawl and your trigger finger itch. Something was coming. I still remember walking into that tent for the first time. Duffel bag slung over my shoulder like I was heading to summer camp instead of hell. The other guys barely looked up from their card game, cigarette smoke creating a hazy curtain between us. "Fresh meat," someone muttered, and a few others chuckled without much humor. Sergeant Kowalski emerged from behind a stack of ammo crates, his face weathered like old leather, and eyes that had seen too much. He looked me up and down with the expression of a man evaluating livestock. "You Sullivan?" His Chicago accent cut through the humid air. "Yes, Sergeant." "Marcus Sullivan." "Marcus," he repeated, shaking his head. "Nobody's got time for fancy names out here, kid. You're Mac now. That bunk over there's yours." He pointed to a cot that looked like it had been through a meat grinder. The guy who'd called me fresh meat stood up. Jake Morrison, I'd learn later, 25 years old but looking 40, with muscles built from hauling artillery and a permanent scowl etched into his features. "Where you from, Mac?" The way he said my new name sounded like he was tasting something sour. "Montana." "Montana?" Jake laughed, but it wasn't friendly. "Let me guess. Daddy's ranch, wide open spaces, probably never seen a real fight in your life." I felt my face flush, but kept my mouth shut. Back home, I would have had something to say about that. Here, I was smart enough to know I hadn't earned the right to speak yet. Doc Martinez looked up from his medical kit, younger than the others, but with steady hands and kind eyes. "Give the kid a break, Jake. We were all new once. Some of us grew up fast," Jake shot back. "Others got their buddies killed learning." The tent fell silent except for the distant sound of helicopters and artillery. I set my gear down carefully, feeling the weight of their stares. These men had bled together, lost friends together, survived together. I was an outsider who might get them killed through inexperience. Sergeant Kowalski clapped me on the shoulder, his grip firm but not unkind. "Welcome to paradise, Mac. Try to keep your head attached." 3 days later, Lieutenant Anderson called us into the briefing tent. Maps covered every surface, marked with red circles and arrows that looked like bloody wounds. The air felt thick with more than just humidity. You could taste the tension. "Intelligence has located a major supply depot," Anderson began, his West Point training evident in every crisp syllable. "Underground, Xiu Chi Tunnel Complex, Sector 7. Jake shifted uncomfortably. "How major we talking, Lieutenant?" "Weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, enough to supply 3 companies for months." Anderson's finger traced a section of map. "Command wants it eliminated." Sergeant Kowalski leaned forward, studying the markings. "What's the approach?" "That's the problem." Anderson's voice dropped. "It's deep, narrow access points. Someone needs to go down there, plant charges, and get out." The silence that followed was deafening. Every man in that tent knew what going down there meant. The tunnels were death traps, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, filled with booby traps, poisonous snakes, and enemy soldiers who knew every inch of their underground world. "Tunnel rat duty," Doc whispered, like saying it too loud might summon something evil. "Who's done it before?" Anderson asked. More silence. Jake stared at his boots. Morrison picked at his fingernails. Even Kowalski, who'd volunteered for every dangerous mission in his 18 months in country, remained quiet. "Nobody?" Anderson's voice carried a note of desperation. "Tommy Rodriguez went down once," Jake finally said. "Last month. Didn't come back up in one piece. What was left of him?" He shook his head. "I need a volunteer." Anderson's words hung in the air like smoke. The tent fell so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. These were brave men, men who'd charged machine gun nests and held their ground under mortar fire. But the tunnels were different. The tunnels meant crawling alone into darkness, not knowing if the next breath would be poison gas or if the next movement would trigger an explosion. That's when I heard my own voice, barely recognizing it. "I'll do it." Every head turned toward me. Jake's mouth actually fell open. "Mac," Sergeant Kowalski said slowly, "you don't understand what you're volunteering for." "I understand." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Someone has to go down there." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Jake shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Are you out of your mind?" His voice cracked with disbelief. "Kid, you've been here 3 days. 3 days! You don't know anything about those tunnels." Doc Martinez leaned forward, concern etched across his features. "Mac, listen to me. The last guy who went down, Rodriguez, he was a veteran. 2 tours. Knew those tunnels better than anyone." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They brought him up in pieces." Sergeant Kowalski stood slowly, his weathered face unreadable. "Sullivan, step outside with me." Now, the humid air hit us like a wall as we left the briefing tent. Kowalski walked a few paces away from the entrance, then turned to face me with the intensity of a man who'd buried too many young soldiers. "What the hell are you thinking?" His Chicago accent thickened with emotion. "You got some kind of death wish?" "Because that's what this is. Suicide with extra steps. Someone has to do it, Sergeant. Not you." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, kid, I've seen guys like you before. Fresh out of basic, trying to prove something. Half of them are dead within a month. I'm not trying to prove anything." "Bull." Kowalski's eyes blazed. "You think going down there will make these guys respect you? Make them forget you're the new guy? Let me tell you something. Dead heroes don't earn respect. They earn tears and regret." Inside the tent, I could hear muffled voices, the others discussing my insanity, no doubt. Lieutenant Anderson's voice rose above the rest, probably trying to figure out if he could actually send the newest member of his unit into the tunnels without getting court-martialed. "Sergeant," I said quietly, "back home in Montana, I spent half my childhood in caves. Tight spaces don't scare me." Kowalski's expression shifted slightly, the anger giving way to something that might have been hope. "Caves aren't tunnels, Mac. Caves don't have enemy soldiers waiting to kill you. Caves don't have booby traps every 10 feet. "No," I admitted, "but they're dark and narrow. And if you panic down there, you die just the same." He studied my face for a long moment, searching for something, maybe the kind of resolve that separates the living from the dead in war. That afternoon, the atmosphere in our section changed completely. Word spread fast in a place like that. The new kid had volunteered for tunnel rat duty. Some looked at me with something approaching respect. Others just shook their heads like they were already writing my obituary. Doc Martinez found me cleaning my rifle for the 3rd time that day, my hands needing something to do while my mind raced. "You know," he said, settling down beside me on an empty ammo crate, "my grandfather used to tell stories about the coal mines back in Mexico. Said the darkness down there could drive a man crazy if he let it." "This is different," I said, running the cleaning cloth along the barrel. "Is it?" Doc's voice was gentle but probing. "Mac, I've been thinking about what you said in there. About someone having to do it. That's true. But why does it have to be you?" I stopped cleaning and looked at him directly. "Because everyone else is too smart to volunteer." He laughed, despite himself. "That's one way to put it." His expression grew serious again. "You sure this isn't about proving something? Because if it is, there are easier ways to get killed that don't involve crawling through Charlie's backyard." Before I could answer, Sergeant Kowalski approached with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. His face had settled into the grim determination of a man accepting an unacceptable situation. "If you're really doing this, Mac, we're going to prepare you right." He dropped the bag with a heavy thud. "Tunnel rat kit. Flashlight with red filter. White light makes you a target. 45 pistol. Rifles too long for the tunnels. Knife. Emergency flares. And this." He pulled out what looked like a piece of communication wire. "You'll be connected to us up top. 3 tugs means you're okay. Continuous pulling means get you out now." Jake Morrison had been listening from across the tent. Now he walked over, his earlier hostility replaced by something that might have been grudging acceptance. "Kid," he said, his voice unusually quiet, "I still think you're crazy. But if you're going down there—" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal object. "St. Christopher. My mother gave it to me. Patron saint of travelers." I took the medal, feeling its weight in my palm. "Jake, I can't take this." "Yeah, you can. Because if you make it back up, I want it back. Gives me a reason to believe you will." The next morning brought news that changed everything. Lieutenant Anderson burst into our tent before dawn, maps clutched in his hand and sweat already beading on his forehead despite the early hour. "New intelligence," he announced, spreading the papers across the makeshift table. "The depot's bigger than we thought. Much bigger." Sergeant Kowalski leaned over the updated map, his finger tracing new red markings. "How much bigger?" 3 separate chambers. Here, here, and here. Anderson pointed to locations that seemed impossibly deep underground. "Command thinks it's a regional supply hub. Maybe even a command center." Doc whistled low. "That's not just a depot. That's a whole operation." "Which means more guards," Jake added grimly. "More booby traps. More ways to die down there." Lieutenant Anderson's eyes found mine across the tent. "Mac, I have to ask again. You sure about this? Because if command's right, you could be down there for hours. Maybe longer." The weight of St. Christopher's medal felt heavier in my pocket. "How long do I have?" 48 hours. Intel says they're moving everything out after that. This is our only shot." Sergeant Kowalski pulled me aside again, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Mac, this changes things. We're not talking about a quick in and out anymore. You'll be in their world, by their rules, for God knows how long. The mission's the same though, right? Find the supplies, plant the charges, get out. The mission's the same. The stakes just got a lot higher. He glanced back at the map. 3 chambers means 3 times the chance of running into trouble. And if you get lost down there, he didn't need to finish. We all knew what happened to soldiers who got lost in the Ku Chi tunnels. The lucky ones died quickly. Doc approached with his medical kit. I want to check you over. Make sure you're physically ready for this. I'm fine, Doc. Humor me. His examination was thorough, checking my reflexes, my breathing, even my vision in low light conditions. You're small, he concluded, which is good for the tunnels, and your heart rate's steady. But Mac, down there, your biggest enemy isn't going to be Charlie. It's going to be panic. I won't panic. Everyone says that. But when you're crawling through a space barely wider than your shoulders, in complete darkness, knowing that every sound could be your last, that's when panic comes calling. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the jungle canopy, I found myself sitting alone on a pile of sandbags, staring at the ground that tomorrow I'd be crawling beneath. The magnitude of what I'd volunteered for was finally sinking in, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Doc found me there an hour later, carrying 2 cups of coffee that tasted like motor oil but was still somehow comforting. Scared? He asked, settling beside me. Terrified, I admitted. It felt good to say it out loud. Good. Fear keeps you alive down there. It's the guys who aren't scared that make stupid mistakes. He sipped his coffee and winced. You know, I've been thinking about what you said, about someone having to do it. Yeah? My father used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being so scared you can barely function, and doing what needs to be done anyway. Doc's voice carried the weight of memory. He died in Korea, threw himself on a grenade to save his squad. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the war, helicopters, artillery, the occasional burst of gunfire from the perimeter, normal sounds that had become the soundtrack of our lives. Mac, Doc said finally, I want you to know something. When you come back up, not if, when, things are going to be different. The guys, they see you differently now. Hell, I see you differently. How so? Before, you were just the new kid. Now you're one of us. Someone willing to go where the rest of us won't. He stood up, crushing his empty cup. But that also means we're going to worry about you down there. All of us. Even Jake. Speaking of Jake, he emerged from the shadows like he'd been listening. His usual scowl was softer somehow, replaced by something that might have been concern. Couldn't sleep either? He asked. Not really. Jake sat down on my other side, and for a moment we were just 3 soldiers trying to make sense of an insane situation. The hierarchy, the tension, all of it faded away in the face of what tomorrow would bring. I owe you an apology, Jake said quietly. What I said when you first got here, about getting people killed through inexperience. I was wrong. Were you? Yeah. Because experience doesn't mean anything down in those tunnels. Rodriguez had experience. Lots of it. But experience can't prepare you for that kind of darkness. Dawn came too soon, and not soon enough. I'd managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, spending most of the night staring at the canvas ceiling and listening to the sounds of other men's nightmares. When Reveille finally sounded, I was already dressed and checking my equipment for the 10th time. The tunnel entrance was a 20-minute walk through dense jungle, following a path that had been carved by artillery and desperation. Sergeant Kowalski led the way, his rifle ready, while Doc and Jake flanked me like bodyguards escorting a condemned man to his execution. "Remember," Kowalski said as we approached the site, "3 tugs on the wire means you're okay. Anything else means we pull you out. Mission or no mission." The entrance itself was almost anticlimactic, just a hole in the ground, maybe 3 feet across, surrounded by sandbags and camouflage netting. It looked like the mouth of hell, dark and waiting. Lieutenant Anderson was already there with the demolitions expert, a thin soldier named Peterson who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Charges are set on a timer," Peterson explained, his voice tight with nerves. 15 minutes once you activate them. Should be plenty of time to get clear, but don't dawdle." I knelt beside the entrance and peered down. The tunnel disappeared into absolute darkness after just a few feet. The smell that rose from it was indescribable. Earth and decay and something else that made my stomach clench. "Last chance to change your mind," Anderson said. For a moment, I almost did. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to let someone else figure out how to destroy that supply depot. But I looked around at the faces of my squad, men who'd already accepted me as one of their own, based on nothing more than my willingness to do this thing they couldn't. "I'm going down." Doc grabbed my arm. "Mac, listen to me. If something goes wrong down there, if you get trapped or hurt, don't try to be a hero. Use that wire. Signal us. We'll get you out. Even if it means the mission fails, even then." His grip tightened. "You're worth more than any supply depot." Sergeant Kowalski attached the communication wire to my belt, testing the connection one more time. "Remember, kid, in and out. Don't try to map the whole tunnel system. Find the depot, plant the charges, get back here." I checked my .45 one last time, made sure the flashlight was secure, and took what might be my last breath of fresh air. "See you topside," I said, and dropped feet first into the darkness. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Thick, suffocating, like breathing through a wet grave. The second was the absolute completeness of the darkness. I'd been in caves before, deep caves where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. But this was different. This darkness felt alive, pressing against me like it had weight and intention. I clicked on my flashlight, and the red beam cut through the black like a knife. The tunnel stretched ahead of me, barely wide enough for my shoulders, carved from hard-packed earth and reinforced with bamboo supports. Every few feet, smaller passages branched off into even deeper darkness. The communication wire tugged gently behind me as I began to crawl forward. The ground was hard-packed dirt, smooth from years of use. My knees found rocks and roots, sending sharp pains up my legs, but I forced myself to move slowly, methodically. Doc's words echoed in my head. Panic was the enemy. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, I reached my first junction. 3 tunnels branched off in different directions, each one disappearing into nothingness. I checked my compass, took the left passage, and continued deeper into the earth. The silence was absolute, except for my own breathing and the soft scraping of my body against the tunnel walls. But then I heard something else. A faint sound that made my blood freeze. Voices. Distant, muffled, but definitely human voices speaking Vietnamese. I switched off my flashlight and lay perfectly still in the darkness, trying to control my breathing. The voices seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead and to my right. As my eyes adjusted to the absolute darkness, I thought I could see the faintest glimmer of light from that direction. Moving forward without light was terrifying. Every inch might be my last if I triggered a booby trap or crawled straight into an enemy soldier. But the alternative, using my flashlight and announcing my presence, seemed even worse. The tunnel began to slope downward, and I realized I was going deeper than I'd expected. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. Sweat ran down my face and into my eyes, stinging and blurring my vision in the darkness. Then my hand touched something that wasn't dirt or bamboo. Something smooth and cool. Metal. I'd found the first cache. Ammunition boxes stacked neatly along the tunnel wall. Medical supplies. Even what felt like radio equipment. This wasn't just a storage area. It was a supply hub, exactly like intelligence had said. I fumbled for the first demolition charge, my hands shaking as I tried to set it in place. The charge was in place, but I needed to find the other 2 chambers before activating the timer. Moving past the supply cache, the tunnel opened into a slightly wider passage, wide enough that I could move in a crouch instead of crawling. The relief was immediate, but short-lived. The voices were getting closer. I pressed myself against the tunnel wall, trying to become invisible in the darkness. Footsteps echoed from somewhere ahead. Not the careful movements of someone trying to stay hidden, but the confident stride of people in their own territory. Light began to flicker in the distance. Torchlight, dancing and wavering as it approached. I had maybe 30 seconds before whoever was carrying it would reach my position. There was nowhere to run. The tunnel behind me was a dead end with the supply cache. Ahead lay the unknown and the approaching enemy. To my left, a narrow passage barely wide enough for a child disappeared into darkness. I squeezed into the side passage just as the light rounded the corner. 2 Viet Cong soldiers passed within arm's reach of my hiding spot. Their voices casual, discussing something in low tones. One carried an AK-47, the other what looked like medical supplies. They moved past without noticing the narrow opening where I'd hidden myself. I waited until their voices faded completely before emerging, my whole body trembling from adrenaline and fear. The main tunnel continued deeper, sloping downward at a steeper angle. The air grew thicker, more oppressive. I could taste the earth in every breath, feel it coating my throat and lungs. My flashlight battery was starting to weaken, the red beam growing dimmer with each passing minute. Then I found the second chamber. This one was larger than the first, carved out of the earth like an underground room. Weapon racks lined the walls, rifles, ammunition, even what looked like mortar rounds. But it was what I saw in the far corner that made my heart race. Maps. Detailed maps of our base and the surrounding area, marked with positions, patrol routes, defensive structures. They knew everything about us. Every weakness, every vulnerability. I planted the second charge, my hands moving faster now, driven by the urgency of what I'd discovered. But I still had one more chamber to find, and time was running out. The longer I stayed down here, the greater the chance of discovery. Moving deeper into the tunnel system, I began to hear something new. The sound of many voices, all talking at once. Not the casual conversation of the 2 soldiers I'd encountered, but something more organized, more military. I was approaching their command center. The tunnel opened into the largest chamber yet, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. This wasn't just a command center, it was a full operations room. Radio equipment hummed quietly in one corner, manned by a soldier with headphones. Maps covered makeshift tables, illuminated by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls. And there were people, more people than I'd expected. At least 8 Viet Cong soldiers, some in uniform, others in the black pajamas of local fighters. They moved with the quiet efficiency of a well-organized military unit. I pressed myself against the tunnel entrance, barely breathing, watching them work. One man, older than the others with the bearing of someone in command, pointed at a map that looked suspiciously like the area around our base. He spoke rapidly in Vietnamese, his finger tracing what I recognized as our patrol routes. They were planning something big. This was more than just a supply depot. This was an active command post, and they were using it to coordinate attacks against American forces. The intelligence we'd received had been wrong. Not just wrong, but dangerously incomplete. I needed to plant the third charge, but getting close enough meant crossing open ground in a room full of enemy soldiers. The charge wouldn't just destroy supplies anymore, it would eliminate an entire command structure. Moving as slowly as humanly possible, I began to edge along the wall. The shadows were deep here, and the flickering lamplight created blind spots that I could use for cover. Each step took an eternity. Each breath sounded impossibly loud in my own ears. Halfway across the room, disaster struck. My foot caught the edge of a metal container, sending it scraping across the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. Every head in the room turned toward the noise. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, nobody moved. The commander's eyes swept the shadows where I crouched, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. Then he barked an order in Vietnamese, and suddenly the room exploded into motion. Soldiers grabbed weapons, began searching the chamber, calling out to each other in urgent tones. I had seconds before they found me. The third charge was still in my hand, unplaced. The mission was about to fail catastrophically, and I was about to die in a hole in the ground, thousands of miles from home. That's when training took over. All those hours in the caves back in Montana, learning to move in absolute darkness, learning to trust my other senses when sight failed me. I switched off my flashlight and became part of the darkness. In complete darkness, I became something else. Not the terrified 19-year-old from Montana, but a creature of shadow and silence that had learned to hunt in the caves of the Bitterroot Mountains. The enemy had light, but light was their weakness now. It blinded them to everything beyond its reach. I moved along the wall like water, each step placed with the precision of someone who understood that survival meant becoming invisible. The soldiers were shouting now, their voices echoing off the earthen walls as they searched frantically with their oil lamps. One of them passed within inches of where I crouched, his lamp held high, the light dancing across the ceiling above my head. I could smell his sweat, hear his rapid breathing. If he looked down, if he lowered that lamp just a few degrees, I was dead. But he kept moving, and I slipped past him like smoke. The radio equipment sat unguarded in the corner, all attention focused on finding the intruder. I placed the third charge beneath the main radio set, my fingers working by touch alone to arm the device. The timer was set for 15 minutes, same as the others. Once I activated it, I'd have to get out fast. A hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around to find myself face to face with a young Vietnamese soldier, no older than myself, his eyes wide with shock in the flickering lamplight. For a frozen moment, we stared at each other. Two teenagers caught in a war neither of us had started. He opened his mouth to shout, and I did the only thing I could do. My knife found his throat before he could make a sound. His eyes went from shock to something else. Not anger, not hatred, just a kind of sad understanding. He collapsed silently, and I caught his body, lowering it gently to the ground. The weight of what I'd just done hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't like shooting at distant muzzle flashes or calling in artillery on coordinates. This was personal, intimate, human. I'd looked into another person's eyes and taken their life with my own hands. But there was no time for reflection, no time for horror or guilt. The other soldiers were still searching, still calling out to each other. Any moment, someone would notice their comrade was missing. I activated the timer on the third charge and began to move toward the tunnel entrance, staying low, staying in the shadows. 15 minutes to get clear of the blast zone. 15 minutes to crawl through hundreds of yards of tunnel and emerge into daylight. The clock was ticking, and I was still surrounded by enemies who wanted me dead.